Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I'm here with Chapter 7 of Adventures in Book Collecting by William Harris Arnold. And today we are on the chapter entitled Some Victorian Books and Letters. About 40 years ago, the story goes, a traveler approaching Boston became aware of a persistent murmur or hum which seemed to emanate from the cultured city. On inquiry, he was told that what he heard was the aggregation of sound arising from innumerable groups of people who met almost daily for the sole purpose of analyzing and discussing the poems of Robert Browning. This hyperbole emphasizes the fact that, in those days, everyone in our broad land who entertained even the slightest literary pretension was zealously reading Browning and hopefully struggling with his occasional textual obscurities. It is related that the insuperable difficulties encountered by one Browning society, in its endeavors to elucidate the meaning of certain passages, led a participant in the discussions to write directly to the poet for help. His reply expressed sympathetic interest in the inquiry, but failed to explain the poetical problem. He said that undoubtedly the lines in question had a significance for him at the time they were written, but now, much to his regret, he was unable to determine their meaning. Popular appreciation of the poetry of Browning was enthusiastic on this side of the Atlantic long before his own countrymen had fully awakened to his powerful appeal. This early recognition grew rapidly and steadily with the years. Already in a letter written in 1860, Mrs. Browning says, "An English lady of rank, an acquaintance of ours, observe that, asked the other day the American minister whether Robert was not an American. The minister answered, 'It is possible that you ask me this? Why, there is not so poor a village in the United States where they would not tell you that Robert Browning was an Englishman, and that they were sorry he was not an American.'" Very pretty of the American minister, was it not? And literally true besides. The phenomenal success of his writings in this country brought the poet meager pecuniary rewards. Under our copyright laws at the time, the foreigner had no standing. Anyone here could reprint without his consent, and consequently he was paid little, and sometimes nothing at all. For his magnum opus, The Ring and the Book, Browning received only $1,000 from his authorized American publisher, who was provided with early proof sheets, thus gaining a few weeks over his competitors. Happily, these more or less piratical practices were terminated in 1891 by the enactment of an international copyright law, which has brought us much benefit to the native author as it has to the alien. The most important of my Browning books is a proof copy of Men and Women in one cloth-bound volume, and printed on thinner paper than the first edition, which was issued in 2 volumes. Both the proof copy and the published volumes bear the exact same date, 1855, but comparison discloses extensive variations in the 2 texts. By actual count, there are more than 500 verbal alterations from the proof copy. It happened many years ago, when I obtained the little book from a London auction, that I showed it to Luther S. Livingston, the well-known bibliographer of happy memory. Mr. Livingston was so taken by the volume that I let him have it for careful examination. In a few weeks, he brought it to me together with a copy of the first edition, in which he had noted not only all the textual differences, but literally thousands of differences of punctuation. And I'll just pause here to show a portrait from the National Portrait Gallery of the poet Robert Browning. Typical examples of the variation are found in the closing lines of the last Ride Together, here shown in facsimile. And there is the facsimile. Browning was only 23 when his Pericles was published. A writer in the authoritative Athenaeum termed the poem rubbish, but several literary leaders discovered in it the advent of a poet of high promise. One of these men, whose acquaintance Browning then made, was Brian Waller Proctor, who under his pen name Barry Cornwall had become a popular poet. The friendship then begun held until Proctor's death in 1874, at the ripe age of 87. In the year preceding, Browning sent his old comrade a copy of his new poem, Red Cotton Nightcap Country, thus inscribed: "Brian W. Proctor, Esquire, with the affectionate regards of his old admirer, R.B., May 7th, 73. Browning made it a practice during Proctor's last years to visit him every Sunday. These weekly visits were continued to the widow. Further evidences of regard are found in copies of certain volumes of poems as originally issued. These are Paschiroto and Other Poems, Josera, Farisha's Fancies, and Parleying with Certain People of Importance in Their Day. Each of these is inscribed to Mrs. Proctor by the faithful poet. Besides these mementos of old friendship with the Proctors, I have a copy of The Ring and the Book inscribed to another intimate friend, Ernest Benson, Esquire, from his very affectionately Robert Browning. It was at Benson's home in Scotland that Prince Hohenstiel Schwangu was written in 1871. The collector considers himself most fortunate when he acquires a volume with which two distinguished names are associated. And here we do have those two dedications reproduced on the page here, and I admit I myself am not all that familiar with the works of Robert Browning. My copy of Dramatic Idols is an ideal example. This message is written on the fly-leaf, Alfred Tennyson, from his Affectionately Ever, R.B., April 26th, 79. I have only a single book of the many that doubtless were given to Browning by his numerous literary friends. This came from one who was almost the first to recognize the genius of the new poet. The volume is the much-admired Life and Adventures of Oliver Goldsmith. On the title page is written, Robert Browning from his old and affectionate friend, John Foster. And once again, we have the inscription reproduced here within the book. From the age of 22, a contributor to the Examiner, a London weekly journal of political and literary criticism, Forster for many years was the chief editor. He numbered among many friends Tennyson, to whom he gave an old folio copy of Chaucer, now one of my treasured possessions. Dickens, whose biographer he became, Landor, to whom he has inscribed another copy of his Life of Goldsmith, now on my bookshelf, Hunt, who in a letter to him printed later in this chapter, expresses his critical opinion of Vanity Fair before its first publication in parts was completed, Proctor, who dedicated to him his biography of Charles Lamb, the proof copy of which, with the dedication in the author's handwriting, is now in my collection. The list of distinguished names might be extended to include nearly all the London literati of his day. When the owner of any book writes his name in it, a relation is established which has a significance of much more consequence than that of mere possession. At least he has found in the volume something of value to which he may turn from time to time for purpose of refreshment or utility. At most, the volume may be an object of deep affection, an ever-ready friend to which he will resort for comfort, for joy, for inspiration. The collector of books that bear a mark, which identify themselves as having belonged to any of the galaxy of talented men and women, considers himself a temporary custodian. His is the happy privilege to enjoy these precious relics while he holds them in trust for the pleasure of book lovers of the future. In my collection are 8 books from Browning's library. These comprise a complete little Virgil with the owner's name and the date, July 25th, 1836, on the white lining of the front cover, an 18th century edition of Francis Quarles' Divine Fancies digested into epigrams, meditations, and observations, which in addition to Robert Browning, November 19th, 1837, has his mother's signature, Sarah Anna Browning, on the flyleaf. And here is this reproduction of the title page with Robert Browning's signature at the top there. A 16th century edition of Sacra Regum Historia by Gilbertus Fiolis contains the names of 5 owners before Browning. These 3 books are all in much worn old leather bindings. Another classic is an English prose translation of Achilles, published at Cambridge in 1871 and inscribed Robert Browning, July 30th, 74. A 100-year-old edition of the poetical works and essays of Oliver Goldsmith has a curious engraved title page with a scene from The Hermit, which I ventured to reproduce on page 197. So that was the reproduction that I just showed you of that title page with his signature at the top. Sidney Colvin's biographies of Shelley and Keats each carry the owner's name and date. Browning's lifelong love for the poetry of Shelley gives particular interest to his copy of Poems from Shelley, in which the editor Stopford Brooke has prefixed Browning's familiar lines beginning, "Ah, did you once see Shelley's plain? And did he stop and speak to you? And did you speak to him again? How strange it seems, and new." One of Browning's most interesting friends was John Ruskin, who sent him from the continent this characteristic letter. Freiburg, 29th August, 1856. Dear Mr. Browning, after all, you're in my debt for a letter, you know, so really I am not quite so bad as I appear to myself, thinking just now I have been treating you. I was so ashamed of the way I had mangled that poem of yours that I dared not look you even by letter in the face for some time afterwards. But how the summer has gone by, I know not. I came in this evening from among the pine woods, which were all in their gold and purple of sunset at 6:30, dolorously wondering what I had done with the long days. The fact is, I have done nothing with them, but people used to tell me with view to moral effect that doing nothing made the time seem longer. I found life seemed very short when I was busy, so this year I tried idleness in hopes of obtaining a little ennui, but instead of that, the summer has gone like a dream, and of this dream I have nothing to tell anybody. I really do not suppose anybody else ever passed so long a time with occurrence of fewer adventures or ideas. I think fresh air must make one stupid. Stupid I certainly am, to a more than common degree, and I shall have, it seems to me, to add this influence of stupefaction to the other elements of mountain power I have been trying to investigate. I was a good deal tired when I left London in May, and it was really necessary for me to vegetate, but I did not know to what a very slow vegetation I should arrive. I had quantities of plans in my head which I began on the journey. They are all gone. I was much interested in public events, but no event now possesses any particular interest for me, except breakfast. You will not expect me in this state of mind to attempt writing a letter to a poet. I don't see any use in poetry. I recollect you have written something nice about figs somewhere, but that is all I do, recollect. I am beginning to think that after all there may be some sense in the kind of people who make railroads, and I entered with the profoundest sympathy the other day into the feelings of a calf who would lie down with its eyes shut in the middle of the road, and had continually to be pulled up by the tail. I believe we are coming home again some day soon, and I hope then to find myself better and to come and see you. You will really get that precious book of mine tomorrow, the day after you get this precious letter. I was doubtful of your address at Paris, and then thought every day you were coming to London, and then hadn't your address in London, and then wanted to write you something about my reasons for spoiling your poem before I sent it to you. I don't remember them now. It seems to be quite natural that I should spoil anything I meddled with. You needn't trouble to answer this. They say you are writing more poetry. I dare say I shall be very glad of this some day, but I don't care just now. I have just enough animation left to hope heartily that you and Mrs. Browning are well, and to be sure that I always am affectionately yours, J. Ruskin. I have several other letters of Ruskin, from which I chose one to an intimate friend with whom he had a long sustained correspondence. Of his letters to Mrs. Hewitt, I have seen and read more than 100. Dear Mrs. Hewitt, I wrote you a hard letter yesterday, and had no time to pad it. Hard, I fear you will always find me, in spite of my best efforts. But what a naive piece of consolation you gave me about the mistletoe. I never said that I thought girls liked being kissed, did I? And mighty comfort it is to me to know that the dear creatures are good enough to bear it from all kinds of irreverent tobacco-flavored mustache. When I look back to one stolen kiss of the back of a hand laid unconsciously on a sofa edge 20 years ago, as to the sweetest sacrilege, never to be forgotten, nor enough repented of, and verily I have never been able to understand how woman could love man. You are all made up of beautiful things, whiteness and softness and rose color and fair lines, and we are bonny things with beards. It seems so odd that you can love us. That great truth of Roquefald's, is it? Il y a de la femme dans tout, c'est quand même. That's some French there. Which, however, I read, Tout ce qu'on aime, c'est dans la femme, appears to me to account scientifically for our loving you. Roses and clouds and blue twilight and golden waves, all lovely things in fact, meet in you, but in us nothing but crabbed and common things. Yet Brett, the pre-Raphaelite, says this is all prejudice, and that in the human race, as in every other, the male is the most beautiful animal. I can't conceive what he means. It's true enough, however, of parrots and tigers and butterflies. I'll send you your Keats soon, but I feel that it is no use marking. Everyone in any given poet will like some things better than others. But in all good writers, the work is simply good and well done throughout, and one finds it is so only by quiet comparison of it with fact through lengths of time. Meditate, for instance, over this truth as descriptive of the advance of sunrise on a hillside, cold springs that run to warm their chilliest bubbles in the grass. You must, of course, take Keats, like everybody else, at his special value. He is the poet of the senses par excellence. If you can write any day soon to say you are better again, pray do. The outlines are excellent, steady, and right, and the light and shade finely felt. They are given. They will be very useful to me. The mistletoe is grand, the color and rounding of berry beautifully given. Always yours affectionately, J.R. The art critic was frequently appealed to for advice. Ruskin's helpful responses are well typified in this letter written to Miss Elizabeth Salt of Birmingham. My dear Madame, you are just in the position in which many earnest young people are, and in which it is at present singularly difficult to help them, for there is in reality no wholesome elementary book on drawing. It seems very egotistic, but it is the truth, and I cannot help saying it, that I think if you will wait 4 more months, my 3rd volume of Modern Painters, which will DV be out about Christmas, will tell you better what you want to know than anything else you could get, and soon I hope to be able to organize some system of school teaching and print a little account of it, which may help you still more. But meantime, this much may so far help you. Drawing is the easiest of all the accomplishments, but it cannot be learned in 6 weeks. To learn the piano, a girl gives and must give 4 hours a day for 4 years. 1 hour a day for 1 year, well applied, will teach her to draw well. Not less. All good drawing consists merely in dirtying the paper delicately. All touch and dexterous trickery is barbarism. In a fine drawing by Leonardo da Vinci, you cannot see the first touches, you only feel that something is there by the effect. Nearly the beginning and end of everything is gradation. All power is expressed by subtlety of this. If for the first 4 months of this autumn you will spend your time merely in trying to get the power of shading delicately, fumbling at it as best you can, and utterly despising all that will be said to you about boldness, dash, effect, etc., etc., you will be making progress. If you would like, I will send you a copy of 2 done by my workmen pupils, but I can't write letters nor give advice much at present, being very busy. Truly yours, J. Ruskin. One of the outstanding features of the followers of the poetic muse is their generous appreciation of one another's gifts of expression. Of this we have a marked example in a letter written by Browning to Walter Savage Landor. The respective ages of the 2 men were 34 and 71. New Cross, Hatcham, Surrey, June 25th, 1846. My dear Landor, when your great gift of those 2 admirable books reached me, I thought without affection that a fresh study of their contents would be my best help towards acknowledging such a favor properly. As it is, now that the study has only extended to about half a volume, I seem to find that I had much better thanked you at once. So altogether extraordinary is the display of the rarest intellectual powers, I do believe that were ever brought together in one man. I believe, too, that before a very few years, your bare rights will be given you, and the age will do justice to its greatest poet. You doubt this, I remember, and other people may doubt it. Be it so. I shall be glad and proud to try the question, and wait the issue with doubters, whosoever, and my regard in case of success will be ample, if they please not to forget that I entertained and expressed this opinion many years ago, on much narrower evidence than the matchless work before me. Ever yours most gratefully, Robert Browning. The two admirable books include Lander's complete poetical and prose writings, except those in Latin. I wish I might say that I possess the actual volumes sent to Browning. As it is, I must be content with those of the same original issue which were presented to our erstwhile sprightly author and lecturer Kate Field, who wrote a charming sketch of her friendship with the old poet in his last years. In vigorous handwriting was the inscription penned by him at the age of 86. Walter Savage Landor to his intelligent and amiable friend Kate Field, August 21st, 1861. Landor's most important prose writing is unquestionably his Imaginary Conversations, of which the first two volumes were published in 1824. My copies of these bound together in one volume were presented to his brother poet Wordsworth, an association of names that would delight any collector. A second series in 2 volumes was ready in 1829. These also were sent to Wordsworth, and in them we find Landor's inscription, also Wordsworth's name and address in his own hand. I happen to have the original manuscript of the conversation of John of Gaunt and Joanna of Kent, written so small and close that the 2 sides of a single quarto leaf hold all but a few lines. This conversation fills 8 of the printed pages, and here we have a sample of this very tight and close writing. The facsimile of a little bit of this sheet shows the handwriting in the exact size of the original. The conversation comprises more than 1,500 words. It must have been trying copying for the typesetter. Although Landor is the author of the maxim, "Neither to give nor take offense is surely the best thing in life," innumerable episodes show him easily turned to wrath. Another characteristic was an extreme love of flowers. A traditional story related by Colvin in his entertaining little biography illustrates these diverse traits. In a burst of anger, he once threw the cook out of a window which overlooked the garden, and immediately afterwards thrust out his head with the exclamation, "Good God, I forgot the violets!" One of Browning's admirers, and none more ardent, found in Pericles and Sordello passion, observation, aspiration, medievalism, the dramatic perception of character, act, and incident. This was the estimate of young Dante Gabriel Rossetti. A close friendship began with their first meeting. A letter without year, but written in 1856, indicates the extremely cordial relation of the older poet with his disciple. Paris, Rue du Colisée, 3 March 13. My dear Rossetti, if I were wise, I should write to you every week, and so get nearer to the chance of being written to, as you wrote a month ago. Only there would be selfish policy in it, I confess. Your letters are a true delight to me, or rather, to us two here, and you are generous enough otherwise. Put that and that together. Well, you don't come here, though you tantalize one with hints such a good thing might be. It snows while I write, but the weather has been well nigh Italian hitherto. Try and be with us in the spring, do now. My wife is better in consequence, and has transcribed 6 books of her poem. 7,473 lines, which I suppose I have no right to tell you, seem strangely original, courageous, deep, and fascinating to me. There are 2 books more to compose, but no harm can befall the poem now. How is Ruskin? I am anxious to know, and will write. With true greeting to your brother, take my wife's best regard with that of yours faithfully ever, Robert Browning. I possess another mark of mutual regard in a presentation copy of Rossetti's translation of the early Italian poets, which bears this inscription: To Robert Browning, with respect and affection, D.G. Rossetti, Xmas, 1861. Rossetti was 33 when this book came from the press, but the work of translation had been in process from the age of 15. I had been on the lookout for a typical letter of the poet-painter for many years before my patience was rewarded. Our rewards, however, cannot often be as rich as mine in securing this example of the humility and hope of early genius. The letter is addressed to Leigh Hunt. 50 Charlotte Street, Portland Place, 1847. Dear Sir, it was 4 years ago at the age of 15 that I became acquainted for the first time with some of your writings. Since then, I have read more and more of them, and having read once, I have read again. I possess all the old editions of your poems, and both the more modern ones, together with several of your prose works. You have delighted me, strengthened me, instructed me. You do so still. How then could I consider you otherwise than as a personal friend, or address you otherwise? Wherefore should you regard the step which I have had the confidence to take as an ill-considered intrusion? You will but have added another lesson, and not the least valuable one, to the many I have learned from you. And as for punishment, I assure you silence will suffice. The study to which I have devoted myself is that of painting. It has been my choice since childhood. Lately, however, my mind has been directed also towards another object, whose attainment, I confess, has sometimes interfered with my steadier purpose. This object is the power of expressing my thoughts in poetry. At the same time, I have often desired, while reading some poetical work in a foreign language, to be able, by translation, to communicate to others at least some part of the pleasure I had myself experienced. It was this last feeling which induced me to accept the series of translations whose commencement I venture not, without much misgiving, to submit to the first of Italian translators, to him who has already carried off the chief prize from the lists, wherein my warmest hopes can give me no higher encouragement than that of being permitted to take one among the Mili. And here we have a portrait of Dante, Gabriel, Rossetti. Touching the original, or at any rate unintentionally imitative, Bout's rhymes which accompany those attempts, I have sent them because I recollect you say somewhere that a translator, to be successful, must have in himself something at least of the imaginative faculty. With this I shall leave them to their fate, only hoping that, should you read so far as one of them in which your name is casually mentioned, you will do me the justice to credit that it was written more than a month before I was so bold as to conceive the idea that it could ever meet your eye. The edition of the poets before Dante which I have followed is the Florentine of 1816, the only one in fact which I am acquainted, except two very, very ancient, incongruous, and unpunctuated ones, and a Sicilian reprint of this. I have not sent you the book for two reasons. Firstly, that I thought you probably possessed it, and secondly, that I was afraid of the size of the packet being too formidable. I confess the extreme obscurity of some among these poems would effectually have baffled my attempts, had I not the advantage of being assisted in this interpretation by my father, to whose critical labors on the writings left us from the first epoch of Italian literature, very few persons will, I think, deny at least the merit of my ingenuity and research. Whatever may be the opinion entertained by many of the validity of that system which they set forth and uphold, I think that these poems are as yet scarcely at all known in England. Indeed, I have met with several instances of their being unfamiliar, even to well-informed Italians. But it seems to me that once known, though it were but through a tolerable translation, they could not fail of being warmly admired. The tender, noble, and passionate feelings of some, the simple wisdoms of others, and the delicate humor which a few of them display, these are things of which any translator who perceived their presence would find it difficult to obliterate all traces. Surely no man ever wrote a more deeply touching and pathetic poem than the canzone of Pugliese on the death of his lady. When I reflect that angels might fear to tread there, it makes me who have rushed in to tremble for the deduction. There are, of course, many among the first fruits of a new literature which would reward the trouble neither of reader nor translator. There are, of course, others whose diction is inextricably involved, principally, I suppose, by the accumulated blunders of successive copyists. But more than 100 of them being purified from occasional obscurity and inelegance will be found to be real gold. Upon these, if not utterly discouraged by you, I shall set to work in the intervals of study, and shall add them to as many of the lyrical poems of Dante, of which there has hitherto been no rhyme translation, as will form a complete history of his love for Beatrice. Having promised so much, I must now abide the consequences of this somewhat obtrusive advance, which I should certainly not have hazarded towards any one saving yourself, but he whose heart is faint should at least endeavour to preserve the outward semblance of boldness, or the fair lady will be doubly unattainable. And what lady is fairer than the muse? Believe that I am, dear sir, yours in doubt and hope, Gabriel C. Rossetti. Leigh Hunt, undoubtedly one of the most accomplished men of letters of his time, at the age of 24 with his brother John, who supplied the requisite funds, founded the Examiner, and for 12 years was editor of this journal of liberal thought and opinion. In 1813, a bitter and contemptuous editorial attack on the Prince Regent resulted in the imprisonment for 2 years of both proprietors and a fine of £1,000. Hunt became a popular hero and was visited in jail by men distinguished in politics and literature. After Hunt left the Examiner, he started several short-lived periodicals. His naturally genial and sympathetic qualities rendered him an appreciative reviewer. Where he could not praise, he seldom condemned. Most unfortunately for his comfort, he was helpless in money matters, which led him frequently to seek aid from his many friends. I have a letter written to Bulwer which brings Hunt before us in one of his many pitiful plights. My dear sir, in writing this letter to you, I am extremely perplexed between the imperative duty to my family, which impels me to the task, and the dread of trespassing upon any delicacy of which my want of a thorough acquaintance with money matters may leave me unaware. One great pang is saved me, however, in knowing that I write to a fine understanding which will distinguish between defects of information and of right feelings, and put the usual kind construction of a wise heart among the proceedings of a man bewildered by trouble. I will state the object of my letter at once, and be as brief as I can. It is to know, supposing you can tell me, whether the Literary Fund would think the following position of things with me a right one for their interference, and whether, having been so kind to the views of my published volume already, it would be indelicate in a friend, or out of all rule, to mention me to them again. I did not think of the application myself. It was Mr. Moxton who suggested it to me, which I mention because of a proposal which comes gracefully from a third person, might not originate so well as one's own part. I am anxious to show that it was not the conferring of one's favour upon me which put it in my head to think of another. Mr. Moxton suggested that a mutual friend should speak to you about it. But the time of that friend is, I know, just now very precious, and mine is extremely so, and therefore I thought I would summon up all my courage and speak to you myself. The case is this: the subscription has done me great good, and relieved me from my dreadful perplexities, but it has not done all, by a good deal, that was looked for, and I am in the singular position of having a quantity of purchased furniture in my possession, and of being unable to move without of a furnished house, too dear for me into one far cheaper, for want of about £100, partly to pay up rent with, partly to complete a few purchases of goods, and partly to settle a few small debts in the neighbourhood. I have been in this position now for many weeks, have lost 2 houses by it already, and am constant terror, for I must not use a less word, of receiving notice from the proprietor of the 3rd house that my repeated delays have lost me that, besides the danger of tiring out the patience of my present landlady, who has put on execution into the house in a former instance upon my books, and knows that I have now got additional property to make good another. Sorry as my health is to dig, I am luckily not unable, and dig I do, as you know, with my pen. But to beg I am ashamed even of the Literary Fund, and Mr. Moxton supported me in my doubts by suggesting that perhaps the fund would feel themselves warranted to advance me the sum required on the condition of receiving it back from the sale of so many copies, for which he added he would undertake to be responsible. Do you think, dear sir, that anything of the sort could be done? The favour, you see, would not be of a small or a fugitive kind. The good done would be of a very certain and tangible sort, in fact, the crown of all which the subscription has done for me, and which would draw the distinctest line that has yet been made between my past troubles and my future hopes. Poverty makes poverty. I was forced, about a year and a half back, from fear of not having a place to lay my head in, and many new heads, to take suddenly a furnished house too dear for me. I pay £3.5 a week for it, and frightful has been the drawback upon the hard earnings of a man with so large a family. The house I can go into is £33 a year. Think of this difference, and imagine the anxiety I must be in. I've gone into the cheapest quarter for it, Chelsea, have succeeded in finding it. I have goods with which I can instantly move into it, and here I sit fixed and in constant dread of losing all my advantages. This position will, at all events, excuse my letter in your eyes, however unable you may be to forward its views. I must again beg another franc for the enclosed, my messenger having been prevented from returning in time to it for returning it in time for it to Hertford Street. Pardon all troubles, and believe me ever, dear sir, your obliged and faithful servant, Leigh Hunt. To E. Lytton Bulwer, Esquire, MP. Another letter by Hunt, written to Forster, illustrates the critic's literary acumen. My dear Forster, I grieve to hear that you have been ill, though I am told on all sides of so much illness going about, that one gets a melancholy consolation from thinking that all the world are invalids as well as ourselves. I should have replied to your letter directly, that is to say, the first thing on Monday morning, for it came to me on Saturday night. But I have been in a new drive, and am, from applications from Smith and Elder, for more matter, the printer having undercalculated the size of their books. I have no memorandums about Vanity Fair. I should have read the work over again on purpose to make them, as indeed I mean to do, i.e. read it over again to my family. And had I been in this twofold drive of publication and pay, I would do it now for my own pleasure and offer you the results. But I will tell you by and by why I am in a hurry to avail myself of what profit the play may bring me. I will state my impression, however, of Vanity Fair after a close perusal of its hitherto published numbers, and I must begin by expressing my conviction that you cannot yet have given it such perusal yourself. Otherwise, I am convinced that a critic, so accustomed to receive a total impression from things, would never have felt him to make no difference between bad and good people. His subtle and catholic reverse of this is surely one of his greatest merits, as you will see when you come to be intimate with the honest Mrs. Major O'Dowd, good but merely womanly Mrs. Osborne, smart and good-tempered and sensible but selfish and unlovable Mrs. Crawley, an original and admirably sustained character, brutal old selfish Sir Pitt, another, and kind, truthful, heroical-hearted Major Dobbin, another, with his gawky beginnings at school and his merry and parting love for Mrs. Osborne. Thackeray, in short, strikes me as another Fielding, not with the constant strength, nor the masterly construction, but with the subtlety, the wit, and more tenderness. He is as sure, I think, to go down to posterity as Dickens, and you know what I think of him. Ever dear Foster's affectionate friend, Leigh Hunt. Before we leave Hunt, we may give a moment to this cheery example of his verse from England Pro and Con, reproduced here from the original manuscript. Besides when summer comes, when June is true, and buttercups and daisies flush the scene, where have the showers left skies of lovelier blue, or meads of more enchanting emerald green, with bowers of elms and nestling homes between? The moist green field is one great garden then, fit for the raptures of a golden pen. Let us now return to Rossetti. Another copy of early Italian poets claims our attention. It bears this inscription on the fly-leaf, page 224. George Meredith, from his friend G.G. Rossetti, May 1861. This particular volume has a very considerable bibliographic interest, inasmuch as it was privately issued in advance of publication. The imprint on the title page gives the place and date London 1861, but is without a publisher's name. I have never seen or heard of another such copy. If there is another copy, I should like to be told of it. It was not until 9 years later, at the age of 42, that Rossetti's own verses were published under the simplest of titles, Poems. My copy of the first edition was given to the man whose lovable nature brought him many a book with the author's inscription. In this one, the poet has written, "To Brian W. Proctor with old and true regard, April 1870. Rossetti would have much preferred to have devoted his life to the poetic muse, but his paintings found a readier market. Even as late as 1871, he said in a letter to his old friend Madox Brown, "I wish one could live by writing poetry. I think I'd see painting damned if one could." Ballads and Sonnets was Rossetti's last book. The copy now with me is inscribed for one of his earliest friends, a member of the short-lived but ever influential pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. To Frederick G. Stevens, with old friendship, D.G. Rossetti, 1881. And there we have that inscription there. Are we not justified in declaring that letters come next to the spoken word in giving illuminated glimpses of personality? And when to a man's letters we add books from his library or books he has inscribed for his friends, have we not secured the most expressive and enduring of mementos? And that brings us to the end of chapter 7, and Sean will be back on Sunday with chapter 8.